On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, first Bolton, then Pompeo. What does the U.S. want in the Middle East? Who can tell? And what will drive global growth in 2019? Figure it out with our panel. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has begun an 8-day trip to the Middle East. The first stop, Jordan. 2 days, that is, before his trip, U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton also kicked off his Middle East tour, meeting top Israeli and Turkish leaders and discussing the U.S. plan to withdraw troops from Syria. So what is going on with the current White House strategic goal in the Middle East? Take a look.
A high-stakes meeting in Ankara between U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Mr. Bolton seeks assurances Turkey will not target its Kurdish allies in Syria once U.S. troops leave. Just 2 days before, he discussed with the Israeli Prime Minister the plan to pull out troops from Syria. Following Bolton's Middle East visit, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has begun an 8-day trip in the same region with a similar agenda. For decades, a change in administration in Washington didn't significantly alter U.S. Middle East policy.
It is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
But then, in December 2017, Mr. Trump did what past U.S. presidents had shied away from, moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, an acknowledgement of the city as the Israeli capital. On May 8 last year, Mr. Trump overturned Barack Obama's biggest foreign policy.
I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
Economic sanctions were reimposed despite opposition from all the stakeholders, including U.S. allies. Actions against Iran meant the U.S. president has anchored American policy in the Middle East on Iranian rival Saudi Arabia. The relationship faced its biggest test in October when Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi was killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. Despite pressure from his own party and the U.S. Senate, Mr. Trump publicly backed the Saudis. But the biggest surprise for many was a tweet from the U.S. president announcing the pullout of troops from Syria after a phone conversation with the Turkish president in December. So, what does the U.S. want exactly? And what exactly is Mr. Trump's strategic goal in the Middle East?
For more on the U.S. Middle East policy, we are joined by a big panel. In Washington, D.C., Ivan Eland, a senior fellow and director of Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. In Riyadh, we invited Salman Al-Ansari, the founder and president of the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. In Tehran, Mohammad Marandi, a professor at the Tehran University. Last but not least, Li Guofu, director of the Center for Middle East Studies from the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Certainly begin with you, Mr. Eland. What exactly is the U.S. looking at when President said withdraw ASAP? Well, then the Secretary of Defense quit. Then Secretary of State and National Security Advisor took their turn, all rushed to the Middle East. What exactly is going on?
Well, what's going on is gross incompetence by the president. He's a person who doesn't have any prior government experience, and he's also very impulsive. So he wants to get out of Syria. So he just said, let's do it. Well, of course, after his defense secretary resigned and the coordinator, the anti-ISIS coordinator resigned, he then, I think, got a little wake-up call when his advisors were saying, well, we have to do it slower because otherwise the Turks will overrun the Kurds and it'll cause all these problems. Iran will gain an influence. And, of course, his main policy, as you point out, is stopping Iran. Well, if you withdraw from Syria, that's going to have the opposite effect. Now, I'm not necessarily a fan of staying in Syria, but it's a contradiction of his own policy. So I don't believe he realized that.
But on the other hand, Professor Morandi, since Iran, the name is being mentioned, I need to go to you, sir. Over the years, is the current administration having more conflicting of goals, if you look at from outside, about the Middle East than the previous administrations? 2001, the war against terrorism, quote unquote, started after September 11th. Then, a real war taking place in Iraq. After that, so-called war fighting against ISIS, and in a way making good terms with Iran. But then U.S. withdraw from JCPOA, and now withdraw even from Syria, but then also maybe not. So can you tell from your perspective, Professor Morandi, what has been this strategic goal if people are diminishing what President Trump is trying to do here, which is quote-unquote lack of strategic goal for the U.S. as a whole?
The United States has, over the past few decades, it has been doing very many inconsistent acts in the region. On the one hand, it used to support Saddam Hussein, then it invaded and destroyed the country. It supported the extremists in Afghanistan. In fact, Brzezinski, before he died, admitted that even before the Soviet invasion, the Americans were supporting them in order to encourage a Soviet invasion to create their own Vietnam. Then later on, of course, after 9/11, they went and attacked Al-Qaeda and they overthrew the Taliban. Then in Yemen, in Syria and in Libya, alongside regional countries, they supported the same Al-Qaeda that carried out attacks on New York. We know this from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012 that was partially released, and that the United States knew its regional allies were supporting these groups. So these inconsistencies have been going on, and now, as your previous guest rightly pointed out, while the United States presence in Syria is illegal, but on the one hand, Trump states one policy and then suddenly he states another policy, and even now we're not quite sure if the United States is going to pull out, because Trump's statements seem to be inconsistent with those of Bolton and Pompeo.
Right. Well, you have two guests already expressed their views. We certainly should have the other two also make their voice heard. Mr. Al-Ansari, of course, Saudi Arabia has been an ally of the United States despite some of the recent drama going on between the two countries. But to you, the Saudis, what exactly is the strategic goal that you can tell of not only the current White House, but also of Washington as a whole in the Middle East, let's just say over the past 10 to 15 years?
I think overall Saudi-US relationship is still strong, still to be a relationship that is historic and important for the region and the security of the world. With regards to the topics that you guys discussed with regards to Syria, I think Saudi Arabia is very concerned with what's going on in Syria. It's a war that has produced one of the most humanitarian crises in the world. And I think it's very important for us to look at the complexity of Syria and to not just go with the mainstream media, which just go and attack the President of the United States. I think the President of the United States has done some tactical moves within Syria. I think overall Iran and Turkey have swallowed the bait. I say so because with Twitter diplomacy, Trump proved to the world that Iran and Turkey were not good partners with regards to helping the Syrian people, because the moment he tweeted about withdrawing, even though I think that I do not take it at face value because it was tactical, Trump only has 2,000 soldiers within Syria, specifically in the eastern part of the Euphrates, and with 15 U.S. bases over there. So I do not think that there will be a complete withdrawal. Let's imagine, or let's assume that he will withdraw 90% of the soldiers, of the troops on the ground. It will be 200 people spread it around 15 bases. This will be symbolic to the people because people will not, and countries will not be able to attack any of these bases or any of the territories that are controlled by the U.S. So overall, I think Turkey and Iran should get back to their senses and should not make the crisis in Syria worse.
Okay. Yeah. Let me go to also Mr. Lee. We see the other three gentlemen describing what they consider, from their own perspective, as important about what the U.S. should do in Syria or the Middle East, without really helping us understand much about what they see as the U.S. strategic goal demonstrated by the U.S. words and the U.S. actions so far. Mr. Lee, can you help us in that regard?
I think, generally speaking, President Trump now is following the former President Obama's strategy towards the Middle East. And let's say that they strategically withdraw from the Middle East. And Mr. Trump, because he has long time as a businessman, so it is very convenient for him to calculate what is important for the Americans in terms of economic benefits, like what he said.
Okay, so you are saying the key word is economic benefits. That will be the strategic goal of the United States. That's what you're saying.
But that is, the President Trump's, what he calculated American interests.
As you see it, of course. He didn't say it. You see. So what exactly is the current action likely to help him in that regard?
I think, soon after his announcement, then, he found that, very strong reactions, not only from his own administrations, his aides, but from the whole international community, from the Europeans, from the airlines in the Middle East.
And therefore,
so he walks a little bit back in order to ease, the worries of his friends, as well as, maybe give the warning to his enemies in the region.
Well, thank you, Mr. Lee. You're giving behavioral analysis of President Trump of the United States. I'm not sure whether I would be very confident of taking everything you said as if that is exactly his logic. Mr. Eland, I wonder if you would do, on the other hand, what exactly is the key word that you would put for the United States when it comes to its interest, the strategic interest in the Middle East? We see Mr. Lee say economic benefits. You also see Mr. Al-Ansari suggesting about allied relationship. Well, also you heard from Professor Morandi suggesting there has never been a clear strategy anyway over the years, and it's contradicting toward one another. What do you say, Mr. Eland? What exactly is the strategic goal, if you could put it into common English language?
Well, before Trump, I think it was get oil supplies and support Israel. And I think to some extent that's still the policy, even though, of course, the U.S. is, with the fracking and all, is a lot less dependent on Middle Eastern oil. But, of course, that two-pronged policy was probably flawed in the first place because the market, the oil market in the world, will provide oil at the cheapest prices. That was the government thinking. In Trump's era, I think it's going after Iran because they're an enemy of Israel, and I also think he may be cozying up to the Saudis, perhaps even for personal business interests. I can't prove that, but there's a lot of indications that that may be the case. So certainly we've had an alliance with Saudi Arabia, but I think it's probably time. I think I agree that we've been strategically muddled, not only in the Trump era, but even before that. And I think we really ought to look at our Middle Eastern policy, and I think it's much too interventionist. I'm not sure any of this is strategic to the United States security.
Very interesting. When you talk about the strategy, you could also look at the words that's said by the current administration. White House senior officials lost no time recently, reassuring their allies in the Middle East. Here's John Bolton, the President's National Security Advisor, said.
We're going to be discussing the President's decision to withdraw, but to do so from northeast Syria in a way that makes sure that ISIS is defeated and is not able to revive itself and become a threat again, and to make sure that the defense of Israel and our other friends in the region is absolutely assured.
That's John Bolton, of course, National Security Advisor. After him, the State Secretary of State also going to the Middle East. Professor Morandi, come to you. I mean, the big part of why the U.S. still remain in Syria is because they are afraid, quote, Iran's invasion into the country and also muddling into the affairs of Syria, end of quote. But if you look at the overall picture of the U.S. strategic goal toward Iran, this should be more than just President Trump vis-a-vis President Obama. So how do you read the current administration and the current Washington's attitude toward Iran? And how does Iran, as a result, look at the current logic Washington is dealing with the region?
Well, Iran only entered Syria because of the extremist groups that countries like the United States and Saudi Arabia, among others, were funding. And the Wahhabi groups were a threat to the country. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Jaish al-Islam, all of these groups had the same ideology as that of the Saudi regime. And therefore, since the fighting has died down and the Syrian government has retaken almost all territory except for that area occupied by the United States, and in Idlib, which is still occupied by Al-Qaeda and other affiliates, the Iranians, their presence in the country has declined. But the United States is in a very difficult position because its presence in Syria, as I said earlier, is not only illegal, but it's also completely unacceptable to Turkey. It is very expensive because the Americans have to fly everything into the country, and it creates tensions with a very powerful, important country like Turkey. And Turkey and Iran are moving much closer to each other today, especially after what the Saudis did to Jamal Khashoggi and cutting him up alive in the consulate in Istanbul, and the Saudi and Emirati support.
So you are not necessarily answering my question, I'm afraid, Professor Morandi. I'm asking you about how Iran is exactly looking at the U.S. actions and try to figure out what the U.S. strategic goal is. You're telling me one after another phenomenon which has already been recorded into the news anyway. So tell me about your analysis, if you can, sir.
Well, as I was saying, Iran sees itself in a much more enhanced and stronger position because Syria has regained its strength. Turkey has moved much closer to Iran. Iraq is a much stronger country today.
I see.
So the United States is not in an ideal position in Syria. It's in its own interest, in my opinion, that the United States pulls out of Syria and Afghanistan. But I think that the United States is in a tough position because, as you said at the beginning of the program, the Americans have relied a lot on the Saudi regime, the Saudi Mohammed bin Salman, because of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. He's been discredited, and the famine in Yemen has become a big issue in the Western media, partially because of Trump's close relationship with him. And therefore, it's made it much more difficult for Trump to find room for maneuver, especially when the people who are working with him, like Pompeo and Bolton, seem to have very different policies from the president himself.
Right, exactly. Mr. Eland, would you like to respond to that? You see a mixture, seems, in the current White House, whether it's a hawkish, at least he has that brand name, Mr. Bolton, or a relatively in the middle Secretary Pompeo. Both come out and go against President Trump's earlier statement about withdrawal ASAP from Syria. But the question really is Syria that big an issue for the United States in the Middle East? Does it really matter that much to the U.S. national interest? That is a key question, isn't it? Or it's only one of those phenomena of previous policies that the Trump administration has to inherit right now.
Yes, I think we've inherited the idea that every country in the world is strategic. I mean, Syria is strategic for Israel, and I think that's probably why U.S. policy is, why the U.S. is still meddling around in there. I favor getting out and I favor getting out Trump's original statement, getting out faster the better, because I just don't see that Syria is strategic to the United States, and it's always been a friend of Russia, so I anticipated that Russia might do something if it could to help out Assad. So that doesn't surprise me, and I think we're being the only thing we're doing after we've decimated ISIS is trying to keep Iran down. And very frankly, if we wanted to keep Iranian influence down, we should have never invaded Iraq in the first place, and that would have, tended to reduce or at least contain Iranian influence. But Iran is doing what it's doing because it wants to influence other countries in the region, just as the Saudis and everybody else do.
All right. Well, the war already happened. It is a water poured out, and you would never be able to return it back, unfortunately, according to history. Mr. Ansari, Saudi Arabia as an ally has been repeatedly mentioned in the analysis of the other gentlemen, but the question is, Saudi also want to have its own identity and its own strong regional presence as a regional player in the region. So now the U.S. policy has been switching. How do you think Saudi Arabia next step will be doing? Briefly, sir.
Allow me just to comment about what Mr. Mirandi has said. Because
can you do it briefly also, because you were doing some
sure.
back and forth. So let's focus on the main points. Go ahead, sir.
Definitely. But he tried to project Iran as if it's Finland or New Zealand. I think he should get the facts right, because Al-Qaeda leaders are still harbored in Iran, and no one can deny this, and the Treasury Department has talked about this multiple times. With regards to the long-term strategy of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, is nothing but two things: prosperity and security. And Saudi Arabia wants to take that role to help all the neighboring countries to prosper and to also have a safe and secured nations. We do not allow the Iranian regime, which is a radical regime, to infiltrate through its proxies, either the Houthis or Hezbollah, which is considered to be international terror group. We do not allow the Iranians to play the game of the right and the left. Rouhani is the moderate, and Khamenei is the extremist or whatever. They are all the same people, and they want to have an unstable Middle East, and we will push back with our partners, specifically the United States, to push back against the aggression of the radical Iranian regime, because we did not see any positive.
We see a lot of. We'll give you hours, and the result is still the same. There are a lot of finger-pointing accusations against one another, but one thing is very important. We are here for a reasonable debate about what exactly is the strategy that you see it as the U.S. is doing in the Middle East. Mr. Lee, before we go, very briefly from you as well, your final analysis before we take on to the next part of our discussion. Mr. Lee.
I think, we talk about the importance of Syria. As President Trump said that, the Syria itself is not very important for Americans. As he said that, Syria is full of sad and death. But Syria is the linchpin of the geopolitics in the Middle East.
I see.
Any change of the Syria probably would tilt the favor or the balance of power in the region. That's the main reason why Syria is important to every players in the region or outside.
We'll see how that balance is likely to be kept with all the players in the region and certainly beyond. No matter what it is, thank you so much, gentlemen, the four of you, for coming over to the program and be able to talk about your analysis from your own perspective. We certainly understand a lot of arguments going on in different sides about differences, but certainly it's very important to have some good analysis as well about the policy. Thank you so much, Ivan Eland, Salman Al-Ansari, Mohammed Randi, last but not least, Li Guofu. Thank you, really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. What will drive the global growth for the year 2019? Let's figure it out with our panel right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. The IMF growth forecast on the global economy is 3.7% in 2019. That's flat compared to 2018, which is also a 3.7%. It's a calmer outlook than what many doomsayers might lead us to believe.
The world's largest economy is on its way to achieve one of the longest periods of economic recovery in history. Unemployment is at a record low. However, based on a long history of economic cycles, a recession may hit sooner or later, and the question is how well prepared the U.S. and the rest of the world are. Across the Pacific, China is gearing up for a soft landing after decades of rapid growth. A fiscal stimulus, pump priming, and carrying out more reform and opening up are all part of the government's strategy to keep the wheels of growth turning this year. Over in Europe, March 29 is a key date when the UK is set to officially leave the European Union. The divisive Brexit is the epitome of a lot of the challenges facing the world today. Division, partly driven by income inequality, fuels political dysfunction, which could harm economic growth. Politics is certainly at play in the trade frictions between the world's two largest economies. The outcome of their trade negotiations will inevitably affect the global outlook. While most economists agree that tariffs harm both nations, it is far from certain whether the U.S. president would heed warnings about growth, as demonstrated by his recent disagreement with the Federal Reserve over interest rates.
Where is the world economy headed in 2019? That is, of course, the question in everybody's mind. Let's loop in our panelists to maybe have some answer. In London, Ian Begg, a professor at the European Institute and the co-director of the Radenhorf Forum of the London School of Economics and Political Science. In Washington, D.C., Saruhan Patipoglu, who is the CEO of risk consultancy firm Perry. And in Beijing, Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome, gentlemen, to our program. Professor Begg, to you first. What will drive the growth of 2019? Can you maybe give us some light at the end of the tunnel? Help us to understand that.
Well, first, all the best for 2019 to you and all your viewers. What will drive is that we are probably going to see a comparative slowdown, not a recession. I think a recession is a rather rare event. A cyclical slowdown is probably arriving because we're at the tail end of a very long upswing, particularly in the US economy. And also the US economy had the exceptional circumstances last year of a big fiscal stimulus coming from Donald Trump's tax cuts and other initiatives he took. So that will come out of the system. And in parallel, we're seeing a very, very slow tightening of monetary policy. Although interest rates have gone up in the US, they have yet to go up in Europe, only a tiny fraction up in the United Kingdom, and still very low in Japan. So in the major OECD economies, we still see enough signals that go rather than stop to let us believe that things will be relatively muted in 2019, but not recession.
Mr. Patipoglu, since you are based now in the U.S., earlier Professor Begg talked about cyclical slowdown. That's the phrase I believe he used. What about your outlook for us about the economy? What will drive this economy, particularly world economy?
Well, that was a great comment, actually, by the professor. And you mentioned that there's light at the end of the tunnel, and there is, but I don't know if it belongs to the train that's coming directly at us. There's a lot of risk factors here in the U.S. economy. The fiscal measures that were actually implemented are wearing off. We have a Europe that's slowing down. We have a Japan question mark. So all the wagons, if you will,
and China slowed down as well, sir. We do want to mention that as well.
Exactly, absolutely. So if I have to pick a bright spot really for 2019 economy, I would say Southeast Asia. It's doing Relatively well. We're looking at external debt levels down there. The current economic performance has improved overall. Exchange rates have remained steady, as well as we have a good level of startups coming up from these countries. So that is my my bright spot for 2019.
The ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries, certainly their economy is taking up, but on the other hand, the size of the market, will they be able to support a growth engine, so-called, of the world economy? That's probably a question mark there. Professor Liu, what about your outlook? At the end of the tunnel, light or not? How much?
I think the momentum for derived from the last year shall continue, although it's losing speed, but it's a slight haircut. But in the meantime, we notice that emerging economies, particularly in Asia, will be back on track to serve continually as the growth engine. And if you, China is slowed down, but China still maintain will definitely above 6%, and also India is also moving very fast. So therefore, we do not really have a very strong pessimism, but synchronized the tightening of global monetary policy will also drag to the feet for inflated growth.
How important is it, Professor Liu, as we are talking, the U.S. and Chinese sides are in their trade discussions in Beijing, and it is supposed to meet a 90-day deadline in a way in order to avoid further escalation of this trade war. Professor Liu, how much responsibilities do these two countries have, these two economies have, in order to give the world a satisfying answer? If the two largest economies going to war, for the trade war, certainly everybody's going to be dragged down by that. So, Professor Liu, how much do you pin on the necessity and also responsibilities of these two economies?
Well, the trade tension that is looming there over a year has been really been responsible for the jitterish situation of the global economy, because after all, it is the confrontation between the two biggest economies, and they are also leading the global value chain. So therefore, if you notice the sluggish growth of world trade and also the sluggish growth of the FDI, that means that while liquidity is still going on very adequate, but hesitation among the traders, among investors, are very much due to the uncertainty that can be produced between these two biggest economies. So hopefully that well, by the end of the February, so there can be an easing, so that more confidence can be injected to the trade and investment circle.
Of course, Mr. Hatipoglu, we all understand that economies come in cycle. I mean, the economic outlook comes in cycle, but at the same time, you do see so-called man-made efforts and sentiment play a ever bigger role these days in the real essence of growth, apparently, of the world economy. If you talk about the trade war, if you talk about future uncertainty, if you talk about the so-called stimulus package made by the United States of tax cuts and other things, and earlier the Chinese package years ago, stimulus, you see it all play quite big role. So what about for the current stage of the world economy? Will this kind of man-made efforts vis-a-vis natural cycle, what's likely to be this relationship?
Well, that's a good point, but let's remember that all of these stimulus measures in the United States have come at a time when the economy had almost a decade-long economic growth.
That's true.
So we are seeing actually right now, a kind of a disagreement that's taking place, not kind of, a real big disagreement between the Federal Reserve and this president. So that's going to have a negative impact on sentiments. But let's talk about investors a little bit. We have an investor sentiment situation here that's steadily deteriorating in the United States. We've seen it for the past 3 months in the stock market. Look, investors love risks. They hedge risks. They use different tools to manage to improve their profit margins. What they hate is uncertainty. And right now, what we're seeing, continue to see, despite relatively positive trade talks taking place right now in Beijing, we still have a lot of uncertainty. I am not one to believe that the problems that we've seen between these two countries are going to be resolved in 90 days or over a steak dinner in Argentina. This is going to take a longer time period. hopefully the two sides realize the impact that they're making on businesses, on consumers, on global economy overall, and will take responsible measures and use this 90 days to our advantage, to the advantage of the global economy.
Sentiment, the so-called efforts made by various governments and also the central banks, to what extent they're likely to change the direction of the economy these days, the natural cycle of the economy. Professor Begg, your observation, particularly regarding 2019.
Well, I think an important thing to stress is that even the most dramatic forecasts are of only a very gentle slowdown of the global economy. You mentioned at the beginning of the program the IMF forecasts. Now, they're not dramatic. So we shouldn't talk ourselves into thinking that there's a major calamity looming in the background. Now,
but it seems that the sentiment in the market is talking itself into it. Actually, people are believing the economy is much worse than actually the economy is.
And the reason for that, I think, is the markets can see a range of political risks. There's a political risk of the China-US dispute on trade. There's the political risks around Brexit. There have been political risks in Europe, particularly over the stance of the Italian government in standing up to the European Commission. But if you look at the last of those, the Italian government has now backed down, and the conflict with the European Commission is not going to happen. We can see political risks in other parts of the world, like a new leadership, be it in Brazil or elsewhere, which could cause trouble. But we don't want to talk ourselves into a position of saying there are all these risks, they're all going to materialize at the same time, because they won't. We should instead think of the central case as being a little bit of slowdown, mainly coming from the US over the next year, but other parts of the world economy making up for it, not least because the fall in oil prices is very often a stimulus to a reactivation of economic activity and stronger sentiment.
One of the differences, Professor Liu, that the sentiment is dealing with these days compared to, let's just say, the other years, is not only about sporadic issues, whether it's a trade war, whether it's a government is doing well or not, whether the administration is capable or not. It also has to do with a lot of general concepts that the international community used to multilaterally embrace, but now being challenged unilaterally by some big powers or by different players at different degrees. That is probably a bigger danger. But the question is, the economy still has to go on and has to look better, because you want to create a job so that you don't fall into the traps. So, Professor, help us understand about these general concepts and the current economy possibilities for 2019.
Well, we noticed there has been synchronized growth, but the recovery is still very vulnerable. And now the confidence within those investors and traders are still kept on a marginal level with marginal optimism. So therefore, that really, as how we can move forward, that hinges on, number one, will there be enough liquidity in the financial market, given there's quantitative tightening in the major economies. And number two is that will the debt issue be mounting? Because globally, actually, the debt will be on the rise. And then new technology. New technology does give hope, but can that really be materialized in the near term? So that's also a sort of uncertainty. And of course, the confrontation of the biggest economy, I agree with our colleague that we cannot really solve it, in immediate, say, by March 1st. So, but hopefully that's a good start that can bring people, more on a level field of confidence.
Right, Mr. Hatipoglu, your thought.
Well, I'll build on what the professor said so well, really. The debt issue, I think, is something that we're not talking about this much because we're concerned about the Federal Reserve, we're concerned about the trade issues between Washington and Beijing. But the debt levels, and I'm going to disaggregate it a little bit, if you just look at the corporate debt levels in the United States between 2008 and 2018, it is about 70% of GDP. From 2000 to 2008, when the crisis hit, that ratio was 64%. So we have a significant leverage here that the companies have built because they were able to borrow cheaply because of the low to zero interest rates. And now with the interest rates gradually rising, we are going to see a big problem here. But I'd also like to add that I am not, or Barry is not, forecasting a recession for 2019, but this is a very vulnerable recovery. And I think we're going to see a significant economic slowdown in the globe, more than what the IMF is saying.
All right. Before we go, gentlemen, I want to have every one of you 1 or 2 sentences helping us understand what do you think has to be done right in order to make sure we still have some healthy growth of the world economy, even though it could be a smaller number, let's just say, compared to last year. Professor Begg.
Well, one answer is do nothing, because the growth is expected to be reasonable in any case. And that means nothing dramatic on fiscal policy, nothing dramatic on monetary policy would help to sustain the existing position. Second, obviously deal with some of the political challenges. If President Xi and whoever is representing the US these days, could it be Trump, could it be the Congress, can come to an accommodation on trade, that too will defuse the risks to the global economy. So I think it's more steady as you go than looking for some dramatic action.
Got it. Mr. Hatipoglu, 1 or 2 sentences, please.
We will muddle through this year. I think what we need is leadership responsibility from Washington and Beijing. This is a good test for them, this 90-day period. And I think if they come up even with some incremental agreements and compromises, that would have a good impact. We need better communications channels between the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government, as well as within other central banks as well. If we can accomplish those, do nothing will work. If we cannot, do nothing is going to put us into more trouble.
All right, last but not least, Professor Liu, you only have 30 seconds the most.
Okay, play a fair game of the rule in international trade and investment, and also, global responsibility by particularly those big economies, and also be careful of the debt.
All right. Gentlemen, we got it all mapped out. For now, I want to thank the 3 of you for being with us. We hope this year will be a good year when it comes to the economy. It's important for so many people around the world. Ian Begg, Saruhan Hatipoglu, Liu Baocheng. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Happy New Year. Thank you so much. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.